The tarmac was quiet that afternoon, but the silence carried a strange weight. A German test pilot walked slowly toward a captured American fighter, its massive frame casting a shadow that seemed almost out of place among the sleek lines of Luftwaffe engineering. To many, the aircraft before him was an insult too large, too heavy, too crude, a flying milk bottle, they had called it, a symbol of everything wrong with American design. But in war, first impressions have a way of collapsing under reality. Just days earlier, this very machine had been flying under American colors, escorting bombers across hostile skies. Now it sat repainted, waiting to be judged by one of Germany's most experienced pilots. He had flown over 100 different aircraft. He understood performance, precision, and the elegance of engineering pushed to its limits. And yet, within the next 90 minutes, everything he believed about fighter design would begin to unravel. Because what he was about to discover inside the P-47 Thunderbolt was not a crude machine. It was something far more dangerous. Not a fighter built to win duels in the sky, but a fighter built to win a war of endurance. And the question that would linger long after that flight was simple and deeply unsettling. What if the side with the worst aircraft had actually understood war better? He had spent his entire life in the air. From fragile gliders in the early 1930s to some of the most advanced fighters in the German arsenal, Hans Werner Lerche had built his reputation not on bravado, but on precision. By 1943, at the Luftwaffe's elite testing center in Rechlin, he was no ordinary pilot. He was an engineer of the sky, a man trusted to evaluate not just how an aircraft flew, but why it had been built that way. And now, standing before the captured P-47 Thunderbolt, he faced something that did not fit his understanding of aeronautical excellence. The story of how that aircraft arrived there was as improbable as it was revealing. Just days earlier, an American pilot lost, low on fuel, and desperate had mistaken a German airfield in occupied France for a safe landing zone. By the time he realized the truth, it was already too late. He stepped out of his aircraft as a prisoner of war, leaving behind a machine that would soon be dissected by the very enemy it had been built to fight. For the Luftwaffe, this was an opportunity. Captured Allied aircraft were invaluable sources of intelligence, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, already dismissed by many as oversized and unsophisticated, was expected to confirm everything German engineers believed about American design flaws. But 1943 was no longer the confident beginning of the war. Fuel shortages were tightening their grip. Training programs were shrinking. Young pilots were entering combat with fewer hours in the cockpit than ever before. The Luftwaffe still possessed formidable aircraft like the Bf-109 and W-190, but the system supporting them was beginning to fracture. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of war machine was taking shape. Factories were expanding, production lines were accelerating. Aircraft were no longer crafted as individual masterpieces. They were being built as part of something larger, something relentless. And as Lerche began his inspection of the P-47 Thunderbolt, running his hand along its thick fuselage and studying its massive engine, a quiet doubt began to form. If this aircraft looked wrong, why had the Americans built it this way? The first surprise came before the engine even started. Climbing into the cockpit of the P-47 Thunderbolt, Lerche paused not because of complexity, but because of space. It was vast. Compared to the tight, almost suffocating confines of a Bf-109, this felt less like a fighter and more like a working environment. There was room to move, to adjust, to endure. The seat was comfortable. The canopy offered clear, commanding visibility. Nothing felt improvised or forced. At first glance, it seemed excessive, but then the realization began to take shape. German fighters had always been built like precision instruments machines that demanded skill, discipline, and constant attention. Comfort was secondary, endurance was assumed. A pilot was expected to adapt to the aircraft. Here, the opposite was true. The aircraft had adapted to the pilot. As Lerche studied the instrument panel, the pattern deepened. Gauges were not just labeled, they were color-coded. Green for safe operation, red for danger. Information that would normally require careful reading and interpretation could now be understood instantly, even under stress. It was a small detail, but it revealed something larger. This aircraft was not designed for the elite few. It was designed for many. Pilots with varying levels of training, pilots from different countries, even pilots who might struggle with the language of the instruments. The system did not assume perfection, it anticipated limitation, and it compensated for it. Starting the engine only reinforced that impression. The massive radial roared to life. But instead of the rough, temperamental vibration Lerche had come to expect from late war German engines, it ran smoothly, almost effortlessly. No hesitation, no irregularity, just steady, reliable power. It was not dramatic. It was dependable. Taxiing toward the runway revealed yet another contrast. The wide landing gear gave the aircraft stability on the ground, something German fighters often lacked. Visibility was manageable, control was forgiving. Even a less experienced pilot could handle this machine without constant risk of error. And that, more than anything, began to shift Lerche's thinking. Because by late 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer had the luxury of relying only on highly trained aces. They needed pilots who could survive their own aircraft. As the P-47 Thunderbolt accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, Lerche felt the weight of it not just in mass, but in meaning. This was not a machine built to impress in perfect conditions. It was built to perform when nothing else did. At altitude, the illusion of simplicity finally disappeared. As Lerche pushed the P-47 Thunderbolt higher into the thinning air, he began to test what truly mattered in combat performance under pressure. At lower altitudes, the aircraft had already revealed its limitations. It was not agile in the traditional sense. It did not turn as tightly as a Bf-109, nor did it respond with the sharp immediacy German pilots were trained to expect. But above 15,000 feet, everything changed. The turbo supercharger came alive. Power that should have faded with altitude remained steady. The engine did not struggle, it thrived. While many German fighters began to lose efficiency in thinner air, the P-47 held its strength, accelerating with a quiet confidence that felt almost unnatural for a machine of its size. Lerche tested its dive performance next. Here, the aircraft revealed another advantage. It was fast, exceptionally fast in a dive, and more importantly, stable. Where lighter fighters risked structural stress or control loss at extreme speeds, the P-47 Thunderbolt felt solid, almost immovable. It could enter, commit, and recover from high-speed maneuvers with a level of predictability that reduced risk for the pilot. Again, it was not about brilliance. It was about consistency. He pushed further roll rate, control response, system behavior under strain. Each test returned the same answer. The aircraft did not excel in one area at the expense of others. It did not demand perfect inputs or punish small mistakes. It simply performed reliably across every condition he introduced. And that was when the deeper truth emerged. German fighters had been built like thoroughbreds, fast, precise, but sensitive. They required ideal conditions, expert handling, and constant maintenance to deliver their full potential. The P-47 was different. It was a workhorse, not designed to win every engagement through superiority, but to survive, return, and fight again. Its systems were built with the assumption that things would go wrong, that pilots would be tired, that maintenance would be imperfect, that damage would occur, and yet it would keep flying. For nearly 90 minutes, Lerche put the aircraft through its limits. He searched for weaknesses that would confirm the assumptions he had carried with him onto the runway. He did find them, but none of them mattered as much as he expected. Because when he finally turned back toward Rechlin, descending through the cold air with the engine still running as smoothly as it had at takeoff, the conclusion was no longer avoidable. This aircraft was not trying to be the best fighter in the sky. It was trying to be the most available one. And in a war that was no longer decided by moments but by endurance, that difference changed everything. The landing was almost uneventful. As the wheels of the P-47 Thunderbolt touched the runway at Rechlin, the aircraft absorbed the impact with a reassuring solidity. There was no instability, no struggle to maintain direction. The wide landing gear held firm, guiding the machine forward with a confidence that contrasted sharply with the delicate handling required by German fighters. For Lerche, that detail mattered. Because too many aircraft had been lost, not in combat, but on the ground during takeoff, during landing, during moments when a small mistake became irreversible. This machine did not punish those mistakes so easily. It forgave them. After shutting down the engine, he climbed out slowly. Ground crew gathered, expecting confirmation of what they already believed, that the American fighter was crude, oversized, inferior. Instead, he gave them an answer they did not expect. It was the best operationally designed fighter he had ever flown. That distinction would define everything that followed. Later that evening, seated at his desk, Lerche began writing his report. As always, he divided his assessment into clear sections: performance, handling, systems. Objectively, the conclusions were balanced. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not superior in maneuverability. It was not optimized for close dogfighting. At low altitude, it had clear limitations. But those observations were not the most important part of the report. The final section, the strategic assessment, was where the real conclusion emerged. German fighters, he wrote, were designed for peak performance. They assumed highly trained pilots, precise maintenance, and optimal conditions. Under those assumptions, they were exceptional machines. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built on entirely different assumptions. It assumed imperfection. It assumed that pilots would vary in skill, that maintenance would be inconsistent, that parts would come from different factories, that damage would occur in combat, and that the aircraft would still need to return home. Every design decision reflected that reality. The result was not a perfect fighter. It was a reliable one. And reliability, when multiplied across hundreds of then thousands of aircraft, became something far more powerful than individual excellence. Lerche wrote carefully, aware that his conclusion would not be welcomed. If the United States could produce this aircraft in large numbers, and if those aircraft could remain operational at higher rates than German fighters, then the balance of air power would shift, not because of superior performance, but because of superior sustainability. He chose his final words with precision. Germany was building fighters for individual excellence. America was building fighters for industrial war. In a prolonged conflict, that difference would not remain theoretical. It would become decisive. The report was submitted. It was read. And then, like many uncomfortable truths, it was quietly set aside. But history did not set it aside. By early 1944, the skies over Europe began to change. Formations of American bombers pushed deeper into German territory, escorted by waves of P-47 Thunderbolts. They came not once, but repeatedly, day after day. German pilots engaged them, damaged them, even shot them down. And yet, the next day, they returned. Always more. The numbers did not simply reflect production. They reflected something deeper: the ability to keep aircraft flying, to repair them quickly, to replace losses without breaking the system behind them. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was beginning to fracture. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that were otherwise operational. Replacement parts became scarce. Maintenance crews struggled to keep increasingly complex machines airworthy under deteriorating conditions. New pilots entered combat with less training, flying aircraft that demanded more precision than they could consistently provide. On paper, the numbers still seemed competitive. In reality, fewer and fewer German fighters were available when they were needed most. The gap was not just numerical, it was operational, and it was growing. Everything Lerche had written in that report, every observation, every warning, was unfolding in real time. Not because of a single aircraft, but because of what that aircraft represented. A different way of thinking about war, one that Germany had underestimated, and one that it could no longer counter. Years after the war had ended, the question still lingered. When Werner Lerche was interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, they were less interested in what he had flown and more interested in what he had understood. Among the many aircraft he had tested, one question stood out to them. Why had he concluded that American fighters were superior not in performance, but in design philosophy? It was not an obvious answer. American aircraft were not always faster. They were not always more maneuverable. In a traditional sense, they did not dominate the skies through elegance or precision. And yet, As Lerche explained, that was never the point. War, as it had evolved by the 1940s, was no longer a contest of individual encounters. It was a test of systems. The United States had approached World War II as an industrial conflict. Every decision from engineering to production to pilot training was aligned toward one objective: sustained operations over time. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt embodied that philosophy completely. They could be produced in staggering numbers. More importantly, they could remain operational. A fighter sitting on the ground, no matter how advanced, had no value. A fighter in the air, even if imperfect, was part of a system that could project power continuously. American units understood this, and their aircraft reflected it. They were built to be maintained under pressure, repaired quickly, and flown repeatedly by pilots of varying experience. Germany, by contrast, had built for excellence. The Bf-109 and W-190 were remarkable machines when conditions were ideal. But war rarely offered ideal conditions, especially by 1944. Fuel shortages limited training, replacement parts became inconsistent. Maintenance grew more difficult as factories were bombed and skilled labor diminished. The result was not immediate collapse. It was gradual erosion. Aircraft that should have been available were grounded. Pilots who should have been confident were underprepared. Systems that had once functioned with precision began to falter under strain. Meanwhile, the P-47 Thunderbolt kept flying. Production numbers told part of the story. Over 15,000 units built. At peak capacity, one aircraft leaving the assembly line every hour. But numbers alone did not explain the outcome. Availability did. An American squadron equipped with the P-47 Thunderbolt could field the majority of its aircraft on any given day. A German unit, even with comparable numbers on paper, often could not. Maintenance delays, fuel shortages, and mechanical issues reduced real combat strength long before enemy action did. This difference multiplied over time. More aircraft in service, more pilots trained, more missions flown, more pressure applied. Not through superiority in a single engagement, but through persistence across thousands of them. Lerche had seen it clearly in November 1943. What he had flown was not just an aircraft, it was a reflection of a system designed to endure. A system that accepted imperfection, adapted to it, and continued forward without pause. And that, more than any individual design feature, was the true advantage. It was not dramatic, it was decisive. Today, the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt is often measured in its combat record, its victories, its resilience, its role in escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. But perhaps its greatest significance lies elsewhere, in what it revealed, that in modern warfare, reliability can outweigh brilliance, that systems can matter more than individuals, and that the side capable of sustaining effort day after day, mission after mission, will ultimately shape the outcome. So the question remains, when we look back at conflicts like this, what truly determines victory? Is it the best machinists or the system that keeps fighting the longest? If this story made you reconsider how wars are won, share your perspective below. History is not just a record of what happened. It is a conversation about why it happened. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that were ignored when they mattered most. The battle may be over, but the meaning behind it is still being written.